Hey guys, HackerSploit here, back again with another video, and welcome back to Python for Ethical Hacking. In this video, we're going to be looking at how to create a TCP server. Now, of course, I mentioned that we would be starting off with creating sockets, but it came to my understanding that if you really want to understand how sockets work with Python, then you need to implement them into a simple example. And of course, this might not be very simple, but creating a TCP server and client, which is what we're going to be doing. But in this video, we'll be focusing on creating the server. In the next video, we'll be looking at creating the client. And then I'll show you that they actually do communicate with each other. All right. So we'll be completing the connection or the communication. Now, before we get started, I just want to say that I am using Windows, and the reason is I am transferring my virtual machines into the cloud, and that's because I've been having a lot of issues with my storage and my hard drives getting corrupt, and some of them have just failed on me. So I'll be migrating most of my virtual machines, to the cloud, and then I'll be accessing them locally on my computer without having to store the large files. So I'm working on migrating that, but nonetheless, I'm still using Visual Studio Code. I've installed the Python extension by Microsoft, and we're ready to go. Now, before we move forward, I just want to throw out another small disclaimer is for those of you saying that I'm using Black Hat Python or something like that, just go and read that book and then look at my videos. If you find anything that, that moves back and forth, then you can come and tell me that I am. But you saying something without evidence is kind of stupid from your point of view, So I would really ask you honestly, before you hit out with your comments, I like to see real criticism when it's backed by facts. So as I said, I'm focusing on Python3. Black Hat Python, is very relevant today, and none of those scripts even work. So you'll actually see during the course of this series that I'm not pulling anything from a book. I'm creating these things on my own, and I'm going to be creating unique scripts. If you have a problem with that or a problem with me, then, express it differently or honestly. That being said, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. If you have an issue and you back it with evidence or facts, stop playing around these little childish games. All right. Let me move away from that because I don't want the video to turn into a negative type of feeling here. That being said, let's get started now. Now, as I said, I wanted to start off with sockets. Now, the problem, as I said, with sockets is they're a very important thing when it comes down to penetration testing with Python, and that's because they initialize connections and they allow the sending of and receiving of data. So if you might be a little bit confused or you have no idea of what a socket is, don't worry. I'm going to explain them to you in both a technical and a simple definition. So in terms of technicality, a socket is an internal endpoint for sending and receiving data. All right. Now, if I was to explain it simply, we can use the analogy after which it was named. A socket is like an outlet. All right. That essentially gives you connection of power. That gives you a connection of power from your transformer, from the grid, to the transformer, to your house, and then you can finally use the power. The only thing about that analogy is that you cannot send power through the socket. You only receive it. The thing about a network socket, it allows you to send and receive data. All right. So it's an internal endpoint, which means it works locally. So, we've talked about ports and how they work. So that's how it works. All right. Now, the socket module or the socket library in the Python standard library is a fantastic module and allows you to implement this connection, or allows you to implement sockets using different protocols. So for example, we are going to be looking at TCP, but we also have UDP, which is awesome. Okay. So when we talk about sockets in Python, we have the socket module. Now the socket module, for you to utilize it, is you need to import it, and then finally to use it in your code, you need to call the socket function, which is denoted by socket.socket, as you probably know. But if you don't know, we'll be looking at it as we create the TCP server. Okay. So we are going to be, we're going to be importing the socket module, and then we need to use the socket function that is available in the socket module. And that also has a very specific syntax, a syntax that not many people understand. And that's what I want to clear up here. The thing about Python is we need to create an object. The object will then call the socket function. Now in that socket function, you have parameters that you need to specify. For example, we have the socket family. The socket family is usually specified in the form of AFINet, which you've heard of, and I'll explain what that is. And then you have your socket type, which is specified by sockstream or sockdgram to specify the two of the most important ones. And those are the two parameters that you need to specify, okay? Especially with Python3. So let me explain what AFINet is used for in terms of socket family. So when we're specifying socket family, you usually see that we use socket.sockstream or sock or the AFINet. Now we start off with AFINet. AFINet is used to specify the protocol that will be used for communication. You might be wondering, well, what are you talking about? We're using TCP or UDP. What other protocols are you talking about? The protocol I'm talking about is either IPv4 or IPv6. As you know, the transmission control protocol has different ways of routing data through a network. So we'll be using IPv4, which is denoted by AFINet. We then have the socket type, which is denoted by either sockstream or sockdgram. Now these depend on the type of connections that you'll be using in terms of protocols. So for example, sockstream will mean you're specifying TCP as your, which will mean you're specifying connection-oriented protocols like TCP. What do I mean by this? TCP is a connection-oriented protocol that essentially involves you performing a three-way handshake to initialize connection with a server and a client. Okay, so the other, the connectionless protocols like UDP, you would use the socket type of sockdgram. Okay, so I hope I'm not confusing here. We'll be looking at how this applies practically in a few seconds. All right, so let's move on now to the functions or the methods that we will be using. So some of the most common ones we'll be using are the bind method, which will allow us to bind the host and the port to a socket. We then have the listen function or method that will allow us to start the TCP listener. We have the accept method, which will allow us to accept the incoming TCP client information. We then have the most common ones, which you probably know, but if you don't worry. We then have the send function, which allows us to send a TCP message or a message over TCP. We then have the the receive method that allows us to receive TCP messages or a message over TCP. And then we have the the close method, which allows us to close the socket and therefore ending the connection, as you would have probably guessed. Alright, so we'll be using all of those methods and I'll be explaining them as we move on. So we'll be creating a simple TCP server. So let's get started with that. So I'm using Visual Studio Code. I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to save this on my desktop right here. And I'm going to call it server.py. So we are using Python3. So if you're running this on Linux and you want to specify the working environment, you know how to do that. We would specify the arguments here, let me just actually zoom in here if I can. I actually forgot the commands that I can use here. If I go into preferences, let's see if we can do that. Settings. Where is the font size? There we are, editor font size. Let me change that to 18 if I can. For some reason I can't edit that. Let me just use that. Oops, sorry about this. User settings. Alright, so it looks like we have to do that manually. So editor dot font size. Where is that font size? There we are, font size, and then we can change this to something like 18, right? So something like that. And we save this, hopefully that applies. There we are. Yeah, that has applied perfectly. All right, so now we can get back into the video. So we go back, we specify the working directory, which if you're on Linux is user bin, and then if you're using Python 2, you would specify the environment, which is Python 2, and then, but in this case, we're using Python 3. Alright, so that's what you do. Now this doesn't matter on Windows, it'll automatically use Python 3 because that's what I have installed. So now we need to import the socket module, alright? So socket, and as you can see we've imported it, really simple. I love Python. Now we need to create the object, the socket object. Now many people like using the S. The thing about using the S is it kind of confuses you as to what's going on. So I'm gonna call this server socket. All right, you can call it server socket object if you want to, but I'm going to keep it simple. That's the object. So now we are calling the socket function. So we'll say socket dot socket like so, socket dot socket, and now in here we would specify like so. You can open the brackets if you want to. Others like doing it in the same line. Now we need to specify the socket function and the socket type, the socket family and the socket type. Sorry, not the function. We've already specified the socket function. So now we would say socket.af inet. That means we are using IPv4, and then we need to specify the type. All right. So socket. Sorry about that. I've got a little bit confused there. My keyboard is not even in front of me. So socket.sockstream. All right. That essentially tells us what type of communication we're going to be doing it, through what protocol, TCP or UDP. In this case, we are using a connection-based protocol. Again, in this case, TCP. So now that we have specified that, we now need to create another object that will store we need to essentially store the host name, which will use the get host name. We'll be using the get host name function from. That's another function that I didn't specify earlier, but I'll explain what it does. So we will say host, we're getting the host information. So we're getting the host name. So socket.hostname. And again, actually it's not host name, it's get host name. The thing about this is a function that will get the host name. So it'll get the address and any other information that we specify. I'll get to this in a second. We then need to specify the port that we'll be listening on. Now this you can specify to whatever you want. I'm going to set mine on, if you're on Windows, it's going to ask you for your firewall permissions to make to allow that to allow you to listen on that port. So make sure you accept it with administrator privileges. So I'm going to set the port to something like 444. I usually like that. I don't really know, and a lot of you guys have pointed that out. All right, so now we need to use the get. We have got the host name. We now need to bind. We need to bind the object. We need to bind the values that we got back, which are the host and port. But we need to bind them to the object that we created, which is the server socket. So right, so we're going to say server socket, and now we need to bind it. So we're going to say dot bind. And this essentially means we're going to be binding the addresses that we got, which is the host and the port, to a socket. And the socket we've already specified as the socket object which we've created. All right, so bind, and what are we binding in here? We are binding the host and the port. All right, so we've specified the host, as you can see here, and we've got the port right there. So that's working out quite well. Everything makes sense. Now we need to listen for TCP. We need to set up a TCP listener, listen for TCP connections from the client. So we need to set up a listener. So server socket.listen. All right. And of course, you can add comments to your code if you want to. Once I'll upload this to GitHub, by the way, the link will be in the description. It should have documentation as to what's going on. All right, so we need to listen, and now in the parameters here, we can specify how many connections we can listen to at a time. So a lot of people actually forget this, and they try and connect from various computers, whilst one has already initialized the connection. So if you want to connect to this server from many computers, you can specify the amount. So I can specify 3, for example, and you can specify as many as you want there. All right, so now that we've specified we have specified the listener and how many connections, how many requests we should have, or how many requests to allow at a given time, we can now use a while loop here. So we're going to say while, and we could have added this into a loop at the beginning, but I was going through this and I decided that we can specify an option here. While all of this is true, all right, when we get all the connection information, we can then say establish the connection. All right, so we create another object here. So we say client socket, which we'll be using in the next video, client socket, and the address. We can specify also another one, address. This is going to be equal to the server socket, which is the server socket object. And then remember I said we're going to be using the server socket methods or functions, like the accept function, which will allow the TCP connection. So we'll say server socket dot accept. All right, and this will accept the TCP information coming from the client. All right, now we can print in some data here. So we'll say print, and we can say, for example, we can notify the server that we've gotten a connection. So we've said received connection from, and then we can use concatenation. So received connection from, we can say let's see, received connection from we got the address, which is, we need to convert it into a string. So we can concatenate this and say, sorry about that. We got the string and we're going to convert that. That is the address. All right. We're going to convert it into a string because the client socket information will still be in terms of the host. The address needs to be saved as well. All right. So we've converted that into a string. Awesome. Now we need to create a message, and we can say message is equal to, let's see. We can say thank you for connecting to the server, or we can say, we can also add something a little welcomey, so hello, or something really stupid like that. I'm not really thinking this through in terms of the amount of information I'm trying to add here. We can then also start concatenation here, and we can then specify, let's see, do we need to move to the next line? Yes. So we would specify now that we want to move back. We want to go to the next line. So rn. All right. And oops, sorry about that. My keyboard is so far away from me. It's unbelievable at this point. All right. So we'll specify that now we need, we can now decide whether we want to encode the message in terms of types of encoding, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to overcomplicate you guys. So now we can close the socket that we created, which was with the client socket, which again is not related to the server socket. So we can say client socket, and we can say dot close. All right. So this is going to close the connection while any of this information is true. All right. So that is how to create a TCP server in Python 3. Now, of course, I would like to think that I've explained everything correctly, but if you have queries as to any, for any part of this, or you have any questions or suggestions, just let me know. But if you have any problems, always just let me know in the comment section, or if you want to contact me privately, contact me through the website. Now this will be on GitHub, and don't worry, I'll add the documentation so you can understand what's going on. So let's just go over what we've done. So we've imported the socket module from the Python standard library. We then created a server socket object, which then called the socket function, and we specified the socket type and the socket family. The socket family and the socket type. We then, we then give the socket.get by hostname. We gave that value to host, and we also specified a value for port, which was 444. You can specify whatever you want. The great thing about Python is you don't have to specify data types, which is awesome, right? We then had to use this. We used the server socket object, and we binded that, we essentially binded the address, which is host and port, to the socket. We then set up a TCP listener here, which would listen for connections up to a maximum of 3. And then while all of this is true, you could see we created 2 more. We said client socket and the address are going to be equal to server socket.accept. That's going to be the information that we accepted from the client. And then we're going to print received connection from, and we specify that we want to convert it into a string. We want to convert the address into a string. And then the message we specified was going to be hello, thank you for connecting to the server. And we closed the socket. So if you're still not understood anything, you can always feel free to let me know. Now, again, I know a lot of you might have noticed a mistake I made here, and that is I did not send any data back. And you might be wondering to yourself, well, what exactly happened here? What do you mean you haven't sent anything? You haven't sent anything. Well, you can see that we gave the message a value, but we didn't actually send it. And you remember I talked about the send function. All right. So we need to specify that we are sending this information. So we'll say before we close it, we want to let the client know that they've successfully connected to the server. All right. So we'll say client socket, and that's going to be, we'll use the send function. And in here we specify the value, which is again, we gave the value of message there, and we are going to be using message. So this is what will be sent to the client once they connect to the server. Awesome. So that was a bit of an example as to what I was saying. It gets really complicated when you're initializing the connection, and we'll also be looking at receiving data back, which is also very important. So hopefully this was a good introduction into using sockets. Again, as I said, I don't expect you to understand everything if you're a beginner. and I would expect you to have understood Python 3, at least the basics till now, but I'll be covering the advanced stuff. As you can see, this is not really beautiful code. I mean, it's quite ugly, so, you know, and I really believe in the Zen of Python, so I'll improve this up and I'll upload it to GitHub, and the link will be in the description of the video. So that's going to be it for this video, guys. In the next video, we'll be looking at creating the TCP client, and then we'll be initializing the connection, and let's see if it works. So that's going to be it for this video, guys. If you found value in this video, please leave a like down below. If you have any questions or suggestions, let me know in the comments section or on my social networks, and I'll be seeing you in the next video. Peace.